Last time we shared some thoughts on the law of karma. And before we proceed to the next paradox, in fact, the most difficult of all paradoxes, we can quickly just take a summary look at some of the main issues that Sri Aurobindo reveals to us by way of the law of karma. In its most simplest and elementary form, the law of karma is that every action has its consequences. Karmafal. It doesn't, actually, if we really look at the law, it doesn't mean that an individual has consequences. It's very interesting. Buddhists believe in the law of karma but do not believe in an individual self. Because the law of karma is the law of energy and its repercussion. Whether this energy is out of a conscious choice or whether it is simply a mechanically an ocean of energy flowing and jostling forces against forces, and through this clash a universe or universes are taking birth. It makes no difference essentially to the law. It just as that whether I know that fire burns and make a choice to put my hand into it, or I do not know that fire burns and I put my hand into it, the effect will be the same. It is regardless. Even if I am asleep and fire is lit on my hand, it will still burn. So the choice element comes later in certain schools of thought. Similarly, we have another kind of thought, a law of karma, which is almost a revival of the Greek idea of fate. And this fatalism is far more dangerous than the spiritual fatalism. It is the idea of strict material determinism of cause and effect. So if I inhale smoke, it is going to harm my lungs. This is a very, very crude way of looking at it, but there is a law of cause and effect which operates at all levels, and physical scientists have studied the material level of cause and effects, and though they do not use the term karma, but in a sense it is the same, that every action has certain repercussions, certain results. So these are two views, which one spiritual and the other purely material, and in either of them one need not bring in the factor of soul or the factor of individual choice. But nevertheless, karma has its consequences. But with human beings, karma becomes more and more complex. Karma is not just an outer action, as in our infancy, when we are like little children, we believe that it's just the outer action. But as we grow, we begin to see that behind the action, there are a whole gamut of forces. In fact, the mother would tell us that there are levels of determinism, and a higher determinism can cancel the effects of karma of the lower determinism. That is the whole purpose of grace. So, a vital determinism can cancel the law of the material plane, and that is very easy enough to see. In a very, again, a little crude example, but an example of everyday life. If we drop an object, leave an object, material objects will tend to gravitate towards the earth. It's a law we all know. But when you put a seed inside the ground, it goes up because life has come into it, and the power of life is far greater than the power of pure matter. So it is a higher determinism which changes the law at the material plane. Similarly, if a mental will comes in, it changes the law of the vital and the physical determinism, and so on. As the higher and higher planes of consciousness begin to operate, a time may come when they can completely change the laws of result and effect operating at the lower levels of our being. And that is the whole logic of both transformation as well as the common faith, and a very right faith, that grace can completely cancel karma. These are mother's words. So which is absolutely true, that the grace is the highest level of determinism. It can completely undo karma and all its effects. So this is, there is a whole number of forces which stand behind the physical action. Karma is not just an external action, it is also the thought, feeling, will, motive, and a number of other factors which operate in creating the law of karma and the repercussions that will come. And this again very easy to understand. Even in law, at least we recognize, if not actually put it into full practice, that there is something called as actus rea, the act itself, and the other is the mens rea, the mind, the intention behind the act. So even at a most human level, we recognize that action, physical action, in itself may be the same, but the consciousness behind changes everything. Thus, when a judge sends a prisoner to the gallows, it is not quite the same thing as a terrorist who in a blind frenzy just shoots another person out of revenge. They are two very different things. Though outwardly the action is the same. When a person defending his country kills or falls, it's very different from a person invading the country and does exactly the same action. So behind the outer action, there is a whole range of forces, and that determines the action itself and its consequences. The third thing about the law of karma is that it begins to change. The consequences begin to change as the stage of development changes. This is another very interesting thing. And again, a simple example is in everyday life, we at a human level recognize that when a juvenile commits an offense, we don't necessarily send him to a prison. Juvenile offenders are often sent to remand homes because they can change. They don't know everything about, the sense of responsibility, and often they don't know even the consequences. There are instances, one read that a 5-year-old, not knowing actually what it would mean. A baby was killed by this boy. Now he didn't know that, what it means, and he had put the baby inside the fridge. Now this can happen. Now you don't send the 5-year-old to a jail because he has done that. So similarly, within human beings there is a whole range of evolution, and as we grow more and more conscious, the law of karma begins to operate more and more subtly. And as Aurobindo would tell us, when we are very crude in a very kind of physical mind, and we are completely under the grip of senses, then the consequences are also very material because that's what we recognize. But as we grow more and more subtle, developed, then the consequences become more and more inward. And there are a couple of very interesting stories. One story is, of course, the choice that Arjuna makes. It's very interesting. On one side, it's Krishna. On the other side, the whole army. Now, he chooses Krishna. It's as if success, failure, victory, defeat, they are all inconsequential. But companionship with Krishna is far more crucial. So as we develop, we begin to experience this inner delight, which is nothing else but a contact with our own soul. And to lose that is far worse than to lose all the riches of the world, because that's a serious consequence and an immediate one. In fact, there is an aphorism of Aurobindo, something to that effect, that worse it is to own all the three worlds, to be a king of the three worlds, and yet be far away from the divine. It's not the exact words, but something to that effect. That you may have all the three worlds, but there is a time when that becomes so important that consequence becomes far more exacting than probably the outer reward and punishment about which one has become rather immune or equanimous with regard to the outer things. So as is the stage, so the consequence changes. I have heard this story, I don't know how far it is true, but at least figuratively and metaphorically it is very true. I am told that a person went to mother and he was used to be known to lie quite a lot. And on one occasion he went and he just started lying. And all that the mother did was she just turned her face away. Now when this story, just to feel that story is so touching and so moving. One cannot imagine that one goes to meet the mother, is face to face with her, and she just turns her face away. And what would it mean to a soul which has reached that point where it seeks, despite all the defects of nature, nearness to the divine? After all, that's the reason why one is here, or why one has reached that point. So as the stage of evolution changes, the consequences also become more and more subtle. Something which we find, in other words, the law of karma is essentially an inner law. Something which we find very beautifully exemplified in the Gita, which often people quote and misquote, as we quote and misquote everything. with regard to the law of karma. Gita explains it very beautifully. If one does a karma under a state of tamas, which is a clouded consciousness, so what is the effect? It says very simply, the cloud grows, the confusion grows, and you become more and more deluded. Now, a person may say, what difference does it make? But it makes a big difference, because you get more and more cut off from your natural delight. People who are very, delusion here is of course in terms of more and more entrenched in darkness, obscurity, ignorance, egoism. So though the person outwardly looks that he is becoming more and more arrogant and egoistic, but actually this is very unfortunate, because he is delaying so much of his evolutionary journey. So when a person does karma under a state of tamas, clouding of consciousness, the cloud becomes worse, obscurity becomes more obscure, and that is, if we may like to call it, the worst kind of punishment, if at all one uses the term. Then the effect of rajasic karma, the same karma may be done under rajas, and the effect of rajasic karma is pleasure and pain, sukham and dukham, as a duality. Almost as I keep using this phrase number of times, this is the old law, that you do one, you get one joy and two sorrow free of cost. It is attached. You can't help it. It comes with it. So Rajasic karma brings it. And it's part of the evolutionary process. And what about the result of Sattvic karma? So very interestingly, Sattvic karma is at a human level the best possible karma. So Sri Krishna doesn't say if you do Sattvic karma, you will surely succeed in all your examinations. And wherever you apply, you will come out in flying colors. He doesn't give any such promise. He says if you do karma under sattva, which means the right karma with the right knowledge of the action and the consequences at the right time, with due consideration to the space and time within which the soul is playing. When a karma is done with all these considerations, which is a sattvic karma according to the Shastra, in accordance with the dharma, what happens? The Gita tells us, there will be growth of sukham and prakasham inside you. So, of course, a crude mind may not bother about it. But that's not the point. A person who is acting under sattva is already reached a point of development where he values the inner felicity of the soul and the growing illumination. What about a spiritual consciousness? What about those who do karma as an offering to the divine? Are they destined to meet success in every sphere of life? May or may not be. That's not the promise. What is the promise? Sri Krishna says very simple. If you have led a spiritual life, I will ensure that in the next birth you are born in a family which is already turned towards the divine. And very soon you will recover the lost yoga and carry the thread from there and move on your upward path. This is the promise. The promise is not that if one does karma under a spiritual consciousness, one will be born with a silver spoon in the mouth. Very often, as the mother has said, it may well be a curse rather than a boon, because it obscures our consciousness. Already we have to free ourselves from so many attachments. It creates more and more bonds. So the law of karma is essentially an inner law, and the more we climb, the more it becomes subtle and very, very acute. So at an early stage of evolution, there is a long rope. But as we grow, Aurobindo has a very beautiful letter. He says, if you fly the aircraft, which is what yoga is meant to be, then you cannot afford to misconduct the airplane. It's all right if one is going on cycle, one can afford to walk in the middle of the road, as we always do, and not bother about the whole traffic, let the traffic stop, we are the lords of the road, it's all right, people will curse us and go away. But when we are flying, we have to do it very, very consciously. Even a small little bird hit can lead to a crash of the aircraft. And that is what we find again in the story of Yudhishthir. Yudhishthir is a developed human being, and Duryodhana is, compared to him, a very rajasic kind of human being. Duryodhana does many, many ills, including fraud, cheating and everything. And he is not only born a prince, he dies a prince. He doesn't lose his kingdom till his deathbed. Of course, one may say he dies a death of ignominy and all that, but fair enough, he ultimately dies as a king. Yudhishthir does one mistake. Probably in his whole life, twice or thrice he has made an error of judgment. And one mistake is when in the game of dice, He has no right over his family, over the kingdom, and over his wife. And he puts them on the game of dice as if they are his. This is obviously an illusion. He has no right to do that. And the consequences are that despite Krishna being with him, for 13 years he has to suffer. Because at his level, at his stage of development, he cannot afford to make even that one small error. So the law of karma is a very, very fascinating law, interesting law. It's a device of nature which has been created for our evolution. Though in ignorance it looks like a very mechanical law under which human beings are crushed, like some tyrant is, governing this universe, when we only bother about our, egoistic needs and demands. But actually the law of karma is not about reward and punishment. It is not the law of some tyrant imposing his will upon creation, but it is an all-wise love that is sure of its steps and leads us on our journey always forward, ever forward. Now, if this be so, then there comes the difficult question. In this law of karma, is there anything like an individual choice at all? Does it really matter? Is there anything like a free will? Is there anything, or it is all predestined, predetermined by fate, whatever that be, or by a supreme power? Do our choices really make a difference to this law? Or when we make a choice, do we really make a choice? One can go really one step behind, that after all we are the creation of our past, and heredity, and environment, and of course on top of it some supreme power, intelligence which is pushing us, and the cosmic play of forces of which we have no idea at all. So where is this individual at all in this process, and does he make a difference? So Sri Aurobindo, to begin with, in one master stroke, he'll of course expand on it, but he puts it in a very, very powerful way. This is from one of his essays, All Will and Free Will. His is surely a bounded soul who has never felt the brooding wings of a fate overshadow the world. Never looked beyond the circle of persons, collectivities and forces, never been conscious of the still thought or the assured movement of a presence in things determining their march. So yes, all men who are developed beyond a point recognize that there is a power beyond our reckoning. And whatever we may do, there is something greater than us which determines the results of the world energy. Whether at an individual level or at a collective level, no one who has even a little reflecting mind will say, well, I do and things happen according to my will. One has to be totally, off one's head, because there are so many things which come into play. On the other hand, it is the sign of a defect in the thought or a void of courage and clearness in the temperament to be overwhelmed by fate and reduced to a discouraged acquiescence. And now Sri Aurobindo is telling us something very, very powerful. That this too is a defect. If this is a defect, that one never sees beyond one's egoistic effort the play of a greater power. Similarly, there is a defect if one sees only that greater power and no sense of self, individual self within it, as if the power in things nullified or rendered superfluous and abortive the same power in myself. So just as this all will is active in the entire cosmos, it is also active within me. The Almighty Presence sits within my heart, and it is not going to annul it. If anything, it is going to bring it out forward more and more through the play. So there is something called as an individual will. This much we understand. Whether it is free or not, that Sri Aurobindo would carry us further. In fact, Sri Aurobindo says something very interesting in the Gita. This problem has been dealt with at great length in the Gita, especially in the chapter on determinisms of nature. And he says that the whole problem with spiritual truths is that we take a part of it. And because the mind lives in division, it puts it as either or. In fact, there is a very interesting term in the Gita, Kritsn Krat and Akritsn Krat. The total vision of things and the other is a partial vision of thing. In fact, he says one should never misguide and be misguided by partial vision of things. And there are two examples Sri Aurobindo gives. One is a partial vision where people say, well, God is beyond good and evil. So they derive the conclusion from that, it doesn't matter what I do. He says it's an absurdity. It is true at a certain plane of consciousness that God is beyond good and evil. But God is beyond good and evil because He is full awareness and all love. So when He does something, He is sure of the steps and the consequences and what will lead. He knows the steps. And to take a very, an example at a very human level. If a teacher tells a student, go home and copy this line 10 times. Or in our PED we are told, 1 hour do all these exercises. The teacher is not punishing us. He is completely aware that these exercises are good, this is not good. He would tell us, don't do these, this is the step, these are the steps and do them one by one. And if we really follow the teacher, we will grow in our body and mind. So teacher is aware, so he is not punishing us. But the same thing somebody may do in a consciousness of punishment. Go to jail and do some activity, physical activity. Now there is nothing which is thought about. You are simply sent as a punishment. And though that activity also develops us, because karma operates at both levels, but there is a difference in the consciousness. So if we grow all conscious as the divine is, if all our actions are moved by an omniscient love, then we are free from good and evil and its stain. That's what Sri Krishna tells us, that if you act with your act completely dedicated to the divine, free from the sense of ego and hatred, then you are free. But if we are choosing things in everyday life, then we have to go through the law of choice and the consequences. And then Sri Aurobindo says something very interesting. He says, actually, people use this as an excuse. They still act the way they would act. And here he reveals to us the psychology. My will is the first instrument of my fate. My individual will is one of the instruments that fate uses. Fate, a will that manifests itself in the irresistible subconscious intention of the world. It is doubtful whether belief in fate or free will makes much difference to a man's action. But it certainly matters a great deal in his temperament in inner being, for it puts its stamp on the cast of his soul. The man who makes belief in fate an excuse for quiescence would find some other pretext if this were lacking. So those who don't want to act, they will normally say, what to do, it is kismat. Now, if they don't believe in Kismat, like, people graduate from Kismat to divine. So they will say, it is mother's will, it is divine will. You don't bother about it because, it's divine who is doing everything. So I have no responsibility. So they will find some other excuse, or they will say, I am driven by my nature. What to do? After all, my nature is driving me. But they miss out the other step, that if nature drives me, then I have consequences which also come. So Sri Aurobindo is saying they will find one excuse or the other. His idea is only a decorous garment for his mood. So because he doesn't want to act, he uses this excuse that there is fate or there is God's will. So I have no role in it. It clothes his indolence and quiescence in a spacious robe of light, or drapes it with a noble mantle of dignity. So we can use all kinds of nice robes, but divine sees through all the robes. Nice mantle of light and dignity. So we say, look, we have to do nothing. God is doing everything. Why be bothered? Now this, Sri Aurobindo is pointing to us, can be one of the many insincerities. But when his will clutches at an object or action, so how this gets exposed? The same person who, when it comes to a passerby, says it doesn't matter, it is God's will in the universe. When it comes to someone stepping on his own toe, he reacts and reacts violently. So Sri Aurobindo is telling us, but when his will clutches at an object or action, we do not find him pursuing it with a less strenuous resolution. Or it may be a less childish impatience or obstinacy than the freest believer in free will. So, when the same person, his own ego or his own desire or object of interest is involved, he will go at any length to put his personal effort to the fullest possible use. So Sri Aurobindo is basically telling us it is not our intellectual ideas that govern our action, but our nature and temperament. Not thee, but mati. Equally, he says that those who are driven to action, who choose and act, they will use the same idea of fate to justify their action. That I must act because it is fated that I must act. And Sri Aurobindo gives a very interesting example. And this example is a saying of Napoleon is pregnant of the true truth of this matter. Questioned why, since he talked continually of fate, he thought it worthwhile to be always thinking and planning. He answered with just reason. Now, it's very interesting. Belief in the divine will, faith in the divine will, does not mean that I just become inert automaton, because it will leave me a prey to all the unconscious forces of nature. This is what Sri Aurobindo tells us in the Mother, that you must choose between truth and falsehood and not leave yourself, let your surrender not become an inert thing which leaves a person like an automaton. So, what did Napoleon say? Because it is still fate who wills that I should plan. And Sri Aurobindo puts his seal on it. This is the truth. There is a will or force in the world that determines the result of my actions. As part of the great whole, there is a will in me that determines, concealed by my thought and personal choice, the part that I shall take in determining the whole. It is this that my mind seizes on and call my will. So the whole, the second part of the paradox comes, just as we use the idea of God being beyond good and evil. Similarly, Sri Aurobindo says mankind takes two extreme steps. Either it says all is a question of fate, or it takes the other extreme that everything is a question of free will. But like all things in life, the truth is something in between. And there Sri Aurobindo brings in at great length the evolutionary journey of the soul. In the very early stages, the soul is totally thrust within nature. And even though there is something like a free will, all the movements are largely driven by nature. Nature has overpowered, as he says, the soul, and it carries it bound wherever it goes. And this Sharobhav, this Purusha, which is, eating the fruit in the image of the Upanishad, is bearing the consequences of grief and joy. Now, this is also necessary because that is how the Purusha grows in strength, whether it likes the fruit or not. If we ask a child, do you like, the food that you are eating? Of course, now children begin to choose, they will even differentiate between Formula 1 and Formula 2, very conscious children. But earlier, they would, till some age, they would just take whatever is given. After a while, they begin to make more and more conscious choices. Nevertheless, whether it's bitter or whether it's good, it helps you to grow. So in the early stages, when our choices are driven by nature, we think we are choosing, but we are driven by nature, yet it helps the soul within to grow. And Sri Aurobindo has very beautiful lines in Savitri. Identified with the mind and body and life, it takes upon their error and grief. It's very interesting. And drinks experience like a strengthening wine, hangs upon the cross, bleeds with fate's whips, yet is the unwounded self within. So the beauty is that when the soul is identified completely with nature, it's completely as if submerged with it. Yet because it is there, in human beings especially, there is a sense of a individual free will. Because it is there. Simply it's like, one knows that there is something or someone behind. And because its shadow falls upon nature, in human beings, there is this instinctive law that I am choosing. In fact, Sri Aurobindo would tell us that as human beings grow, there is a need in human beings to justify everything. And this justification is because of the presence of the soul when its light falls upon nature. This meeting point of the soul with nature creates on its peak something which is called as buddhi, the discriminative intelligence. Even buddhi is a creation of nature, but it's a height of nature where it's closest to the soul. And everything must be referred to buddhi, whether before the action or after the action. In the early stages of our development, we act and we justify. Then later on, we justify and we act. But nevertheless, it's a justification, not the true thing. But as we grow, the buddhi begins to turn towards the source of the light that is falling upon it. And that's when the Gita speaks of this buddhi, instead of being bahu shakhanam, being lent to all kinds of desires and impulses, begins to turn inward and upward. So this is the journey from complete submerged within nature. This soul begins to grow, and as it grows, there is a greater and greater sense of individuality and a feeling of free will inside us. And therefore, the sense of choice begin to emerge with a greater and striking force within an individual. And probably that is one reason, as an aside, why we see so much individuality coming up nowadays. It's one reason is that the psychic consciousness has already been on earth for millenniums. So now there are at least a number of psychic sparks which are becoming almost formed psychic entities. And therefore, upon nature, the shadow is of a strong individuality. It's like a paradox. The caste has become rigid, and again, Shibunda would give us this example, the mother would give us this example, that when the egg is small, is yet developed, the little chick is developing inside it, then the crust is very soft. As the chick develops more and more, the outer crust becomes more and more hard. And then a time comes when the same crust which nature was developing, it breaks aside for the emergence of the little chick. So this is the journey that initially nature allows the ego to harden, even through the consequences. So an arrogant man finds his arrogance justified. A strong man acts with a strength and finds that his strength is rewarded, and he becomes more and more seemingly egoistic. And one would wonder why nature is allowing this. It's precisely because he is at that stage of development. But a stage comes when everything begins to go wrong with the same person. And that is why again we have the gradation of the bhaktas. In the early stages, bhaktas are simply praying to God for some benefits. And this is not the highest bhakti. The highest bhakti is self-giving. But Aurobindo says this is allowed as a concession to nature. Because we are not all at that point where we can just give ourselves to the divine. So this is allowed. So as is the stage, so is the evolutionary journey. So in the early stages, we are completely driven by nature, and yet we have the consequences through which the soul within grows. Then as it grows, the choices begin to have more and more repercussion. And through that process, the soul learns. And a time comes when it begins to taste the delight inside. And in the Upanishad, the images of the bird, one is sitting on the branch. In fact, it's the story of two Purushas and one woman. The woman is Prakriti, the same tree. And the two Purushas are the two poises. One is, it's sitting on the lower branch eating the fruit. When the fruit is tasty, it is happy. When the fruit is bitter, it is unhappy. And there is another who is seated above, who is watching. Dvasuparna, it's a very powerful image, and Aurobindo has brought it out in. Then a time comes when this bird who is eating and enjoying or feeling sad, suddenly looks up and sees who is this bird quietly sitting and simply enjoying all the, it's as if it doesn't matter to it at all. And yet it looks like the Lord. There's a small funny story about it. That a man went to a parrot shop and asked, the price of one parrot. So he was told, this is 100 rupees. He says, 100 rupees? What does this parrot do? He says, well, it has learned some very nice poetries and nursery rhymes, and you just tell it and it'll rattle out. Very good. And it goes to the second parrot. He says, what does it do? He says this can chant mantras. Very good. So demonstrates the parrot chants mantra. He says, how much is this? He says, this is 1,000 rupees. Yeah, understandable, because he can chant mantras, so 100 and 1,000. So he goes to the third parrot. He says, what does this do? He says, no, it doesn't do anything. So the parrot is not speaking at all. He says, what is its cost? He says, 10,000 rupees. He said, what do you mean? This parrot doesn't speak and it's 10,000 rupees? He said, no, it's very simple. Both these parrots keep telling this big parrot, yes sir, yes sir. So, they are both subservient to this third parrot, and that is why his cost is 10,000 rupees. It's just a humorous story, but carries a truth within. That nature eventually is trying to fulfill, however obscurely, or reflect, as the spiritual term goes, the will of the Purusha. It is trying, it tries miserably, it doesn't succeed. Because to really succeed, this nature won't do. The higher supernature must descend. But for that, even the Purusha need not remain just a little ray. It must develop into a full-fledged psychic being. So, what is really given to us? Given to us is, we have a sense of free will. This is a fact. Whether it is there or not, we still will act by that. So what we can do is, we can either put it at the disposal of the all will, or we can put it at the disposal of my own little egoistic nature self. This is the choice given to us. And that's what Aurobindo would tell us, that from being a das to nature, the Purusha evolves into a Sakshi, it witnesses. And from a Sakshi, it becomes the Lord and the Ish, the sanctioner of the works. So, more than the action, it is the sanction. For this very reason, I am right in laying stress on my free will. The reason is, Napoleon said, it is fated that I plan and act. If a necessity governs even the gods, yet is my will a daughter of necessity with a right in the mansion of her mother. What a beautiful, powerful phrase this is. Or even it is a phase of the divine necessity that in many forms plays with the world. If Kismat is the will of God, yet is that will active in my present moment, and not only in the hour of my birth or of the birth of the world. If my past actions determine my present, my immediate action also determines the moment that shall be, and is not utterly put off by a tardy mechanism to belated effects in a far off life. If law of nature and heredity and environment are powerful, yet do they depend on the individual for the use to which they shall be turned. I may play entirely at cross purposes with the all will in me. That is when I lend my willpower to be a servant of the nervous part of my mind, which, ignorant and passionate, adores self openly or under many pretenses as its own God. So the image is again of the Rath, the chariot, where Buddhi is holding the reins, the mind is the reins, and the steed are the senses, and the body is the body of the chariot, and the one who is seated within it is the soul. So the charioteer may lend himself to the fancy of the horses. The result will be a crash. If I drive a car and I say, let the car go wherever it wants. Of course, such cars have come now, where you just fix the speed and the car steers itself through. But there are limitations to that. But nevertheless, that is one possibility. That is when I lend my willpower to be a servant of the nervous part. It is this in me, this egoist, this hungerer, that feels upon it in the heavy hand of fate the oppression of a tyrant. So when I lend like this, then my chariot crashes. So when it crashes, I say, God is really a tyrant, a cruel being. Why can't he just let me have some fun? After all, what was I doing? Enjoying my ride. And he comes to spoil my ride. Precisely because he wants us to awaken to a greater truth. So, the law of consequences acts like that. For always absorbed in its own need and viewpoint, it helps the all by that friction and opposition. Therefore, it misunderstands the firm teacher and his stern yet loving compulsion in things, and must progress by self will and struggle and suffering, because it cannot yet learn to progress by obedience. So, this is the first stage when I believe I am free, but actually I am not free, I am driven by nature. And I get consequences, and I say there is no God, or if he is there, he is very cruel. Fair enough, God accepts it. He says, you are at this stage, you grow like this. But we cannot play a double game. We cannot be driven by self-will at the same time accept that everything should be according to my will, because there is no such thing in the universe. In the universe, there is an all will which is active also within the individual, leading everything towards progress. But also I may, by an intuition in my nature, an aspiration in my heart, and a reason in my mind, put myself at the service of some strong ideal, some intelligent force that serves God with or without knowledge of Him. Then is my will a true will. It does its share, it leaves its quota, it returns to its master with its talent used or increased. Again, it does not guarantee success, because that is left to the all will. The result will come by the all will. But when I lend my will to the all will, it helps me to grow. Whatever is given to the divine increases thousandfold. If I put my intelligence at the service of my ego, maybe I'll prosper outwardly, but my intelligence will become more and more clouded and so much bound by the senses that even if God stands before me, I cannot perceive Him. Whereas if I put my intelligence at the service of the divine, then even though outwardly there may not be a success, though divine looks after at all levels, but even if, doesn't matter, the intelligence will become more and more refined and grow, so much so that it can become a free and beautiful channel of the light and the consciousness of the divine to flow through it. And so also with our heart and the emotions, so also with all the activities of our being. So he says, this is what is given to us. And to a certain extent it is free. For a great liberty is this, to be delivered from the animal and the Rakshasa in ourselves, free to choose the right or be chosen by it. And at the end, he says something very beautiful. But how different a thing would it be if I could persuade my ego to break and emerge from the mold in which it has taken refuge from its divine pursuer. So we may lend ourselves to the ego or to the divine. This is given to us. When the ego mold is still there and we give to the divine, sometimes one may weep that, I've given myself to the divine, but to what use? But Aurobindo is telling us how different if I could persuade my ego to break and emerge from the mold in which it has taken refuge from its divine pursuer. The great antinomy would then be abrogated and not simply mitigated. My free will would become God will, and fate put off her mask. In other words, all the actions of my being will be determined by the divine, no more for personal egoistic purposes, but for Lok Sangraharth, for the good and the evolutionary march of mankind, and that is the delight. My free will would become God will by consenting to be the mere slave of God, and consciously but one instrument of that which is not bound by its instruments. I should know a freedom which sings on the harps of heaven, but which no speech of man can utter. I should be vast and rolled in the waves of pure puissance and pure ecstasy. What will I get as a reward? Aurobindo is telling us, pure puissance, that might and glory and knowledge and wisdom, and pure ecstasy, the immeasurable and unfathomable ecstasy of all being and all life and all force. I should see fate illumined, melting into will with a capital W, and will glorified, passing into God.